All right, here's the result of about 5 minutes of off-screen work. It's called bunchofblobs.ai, and it's found inside the 10 Pathfinder folder. And you can see that I've gone ahead and filled in some pretty big areas with the blob brush, but I'm by no means done. And notice that I'm down to about 5 paths at this point, and the only reason that they're independent paths is because they don't quite overlap each other. So for example, this guy right here that I'm pointing to with my blob brush cursor is independent of the guy down and to the left, which is independent of the guy directly above him. And this is an independent path as well. So if I was to go ahead and meatball and shift meatball everything but the central compound path, this big one, you can see that these 4 are the only independent paths, and then everything else is connected. You might get different results. If you're working independently of me, which I completely altogether endorse, I think that's a great idea, then of course you are going to have different results. But I'm just trying to give you a sense for what's going on so that you can evaluate my illustration and yours. I'm going to go ahead and press Control-Shift-A or Command-Shift-A on the Mac to deselect those areas. And then you know what? I want to go ahead and fill in this big, huge gap here in the upper left-hand area. So I'm going to press the right bracket key several times in a row until I get a larger brush. Doesn't matter exactly how large it is. And then I'm just going to paint in this area. Now you might say, well, that pretty much covers up all the gaps that you had there, Deke, and some of those gaps are looking pretty good, and they're a little hard to imagine at this point. Just bear in mind that the gaps do reveal the limbs, and that's an awesome thing. And even if you reveal an area where the limbs don't quite line up or there are no limbs, we can always add some more limbs in later if you want to. But I'm just basically saying this entire area is going to get filled in. Compare that, by the way, with my final tree graphic, which has a bunch of little areas that are opened up. So we have holes all over the place inside of this tree. And those holes really make for a credible tree. So we want to keep those. And yet, contrary to my advice, I've just gone ahead and filled them all in. Well, that's because I'm obviously trying to get some work done here. We can always add the holes in later. And we will, by the way. Now, what if you're looking at some of your foliage and you're thinking, well, that doesn't look right. That could be better. This looks awful, that kind of thing. Why, then go ahead and reduce the size of your blob brush cursor again. And I'm going to double click on the icon and reduce that size value down to 8. Once again, click OK. And what you can do, for example, this area here, this obvious brush stroke, in fact, doesn't look right. So you can just click like so in order to add some details around that brushstroke. And Illustrator will go ahead and add some arbitrarily angled ellipses, essentially, as you click. And you can also paint a little bit if you want to. So those are some other options that are available to you. Now, what you are going to get is a very complicated graphic. In other words, we're laying down tons of anchor points and control handles inside of this artwork. And what we're doing is we're just expecting Illustrator to be able to print this complicated graphic. And that's the way I recommend you work. We can't worry about what Illustrator can and can't render. We need to be able to work creatively here. And then if Illustrator has a problem later, we can deal with it then. But back in the old days, it was pretty tough to print super complicated artwork. These days, with more RAM built into the rips and so on, we have a much easier time of it. And I've printed out this graphic, or at least the final version of the graphic when I was creating it in the first place several times and didn't have any problems whatsoever. But that's ultimately going to depend on the capabilities of your printer. Anyway, so I'm just painting along inside of here willy-nilly every once in a while. Just painting small brush strokes. Keep it small at this point, especially for the edge details. Now, what do we do about the areas that require gaps? Well, a couple of different ways to work. One way is to just whip out the eraser tool, which I am not doing very quickly here because I'm still painting with the blob brush. I'm still obsessing about the leaf details that I want to add. Deke, we're going to transition over to deleting now. I'm talking to myself for a moment. Then would switch over to the eraser tool. So go ahead and grab that guy. And you can, by the way, double click on it in order to change its settings. And you may want to do the same thing. You may want to go with a roundness value of 35%, like so, and then go ahead and switch the angle from fixed over to random. And let's change the variation value here to 180 degrees, the maximum setting. And then diameter, we might go pretty low. I'm working with the mouse, so I'll keep it fixed. If you're working with the tablet, then you could link it to pressure and maximize your variation value. Then click on the OK button, and then begin to paint away. But in order to make my point here, I'm going to actually increase the size of my cursor a bit here by pressing the right bracket key a few times. And then I'm going to erase over this foliage. Let's say I want to introduce some empty area over on the right-hand side here. Not this big of an area, but I'm trying to make a point. Notice what happens when I release. because nothing was selected, I went ahead and erased not only through this compound path right there, and I ended up creating some slim little path at some point, but also I went ahead and erased. Notice if I turn off this foliage layer for a moment, I erased into the limbs, and I don't want to do that. So I'll press Control-Z, Command-Z on the Mac a couple of times, actually, in order to restore those details. I could lock down the tree lines, so go ahead and lock down that layer, and then paint over this area willy-nilly like so, again, just to make a point. And you'll see that you erase the foliage, but you reveal the limbs, so the limbs are okay. So that's one way to work. Obviously, we don't want to work that big. We don't want to make big, huge changes like this. So I'll go ahead and press Control-Z, Command-Z on the Mac, and I will reduce the size of my cursor once again to 8 point, like so. Oh, actually, let's go ahead and get rid of that T. So I'll just change the diameter value to 8. Illustrator will automatically interpret that as 8 points. Click OK, and then I could paint little areas like this into my foliage if I so desire. But that doesn't really give me the degree of control I might like, so that means I got to come back into these areas after I get done sort of scrubbing out a little area like so. I'd have to press Shift-B in order to switch back to the blob tool and fill some of those areas in because they're getting awfully big and they don't look like leaf holes. They look more like Swiss cheese holes. So how do we get Illustrator to deliver some better holes? I will show you how to paint in some details and then convert them to holes in the next exercise.